Hi again, everyone. Welcome to the second week of Miscarriage of Justice. My name is Hassan. I am your instructor. I wanted to thank you guys for an awesome first week. Thank you for watching the first lecture. And hopefully we'll keep going at this theme. I wanted to remind you guys from the top that choose your own adventure. The weekly assignment means one. So you either choose to do the essay or the quiz. Cool? Not both, just one. So you either choose to do the 10 question quiz or the 10-point short essay. You don't have to do both. There's a couple folks that have done both, and I'll be reaching out to you guys so we can discuss the course of action next. But yeah, please only do one, not both. I'm just going to jump straight into our conversation today. Let me pull up my notes. So, we're going to be talking about racial bias in the US criminal legal system today a little bit. And we're going to be talking about what we have on our syllabus to talk about as causes of wrongful convictions. But in order for us to kind of begin talking about how wrongful convictions manifest, we have to talk about racial bias and ethnic bias and how it manifests in the criminal legal system, right? So I want to talk about some things like disparity awareness, how the government and legislators are kind of reacting to that, and some of the things that are happening when we take kind of a step back. So, disparity awareness. We have to be aware that people of color, namely Black people, are disproportionately represented in the US criminal legal system. And this is a fact, right? This is just categorically true. And there are government and legislator efforts underway to both study and attempt to address these disparities in order to ensure fairness at all levels of the criminal legal system. So, how does this manifest? We know that large scale studies, let's talk about the components of the criminal legal system, right? Law enforcement, courts, corrections. We know that now, right? But when we're talking about law enforcement, we know that there are large scale studies that indicate persistent racial bias in police stops, right? We know that somehow Black drivers are less likely to be stopped after sunset. So there's a suggestion that there's bias manifesting in daylight stops. And I'm getting this information from a recent legislative report or relatively recent um, from the National Conference of State Legislators. I will add that supplementary to y'all's stuff in case this is something that you find interesting or you want more information on. The legalization of cannabis has reduced total stops, but in the stops that do exist, racial disparities in stops and searches have persisted. So, data collection wise, we know that 23 states and DC require data collection during stops to monitor and address racial profiling. And there's variability in data collection practices, unfortunately, from state to state. So, there are some states that have very detailed requirements and other states that don't. So that means we have some missing data in regards to police stops. But there are 48 states in DC that require training, bias training for law enforcement. And we can argue the semantics of whether or not bias training actually works. I do have some like personal and like lived experiences with bias training and bias reduction training. So we could argue about that or we could have that discussion. Some states, Iowa and West Virginia, they have some detailed training requirements for bias reduction. Some states like California and Nevada have implemented measures to screen for bias and ensure accountability in policing. So there's been a marked effort to diversify law enforcement workforces and to attempt to promote equity. Now, thinking about incarceration, right? Uh, Black and brown people are not the only people that are overrepresented in our criminal legal system. Indigenous folks are disproportionately represented in local jails and state prisons, right? So Pennington County, Montana, they show significant overrepresentation of Indigenous people, of the Native Americans in state prisons and in local jails. Now, when we're talking about pretrial release and prosecution, some states are adopting pretrial risk assessment tools, raising concerns about systemic bias. There are mixed academic findings on the impact of these tools on racial disparities, but there are recommendations for transparency, for community oversight, for regular validation of these tools. But we find that high pretrial detention rates. So when we say pretrial detention, we mean a person gets incarcerated, they typically would, see a judge and the judge would set their bail until their trial or would set the conditions of their bail before their trial. And a lot of folks can't pay that. So high pretrial detention rates among Black and Brown people are due to an inability to pay financial conditions of release. So we have currently legislative efforts in 11 states to try and consider the defendant's financial ability when setting these conditions. And we go back to prosecutorial discretion, right? So disparities in decision makings. Prosecutors within the courts have a significant power in charging decisions, which leads to disparities. So we have efforts like the prosecutorial performance indicator that aim to address these disparities by attempting to measure performance through things like victimization and case dismissal differences by race. But still, we have like significant racial disparities in jails and prisons. Black people and Latinos make up about 30% of the US population, but they make up over half of the jail population, of the incarcerated jail population. So yeah, we're trying to understand what we're dealing with here when we talk about miscarriages of justice, when we talk about the current structure of the criminal legal system. We're trying to kind of gain a picture of what we're dealing with and how legislators and states are attempting to combat what we're dealing with. So when we're talking about sentencing disparities, there are things called sentencing enhancements, and we will revisit sentencing enhancements in the future. So in California, sentencing enhancements disproportionately affect people of color and those with mental illnesses. 18 states require corrections impact statements for legislation, and that impacts criminal offenses. Going back to sentencing enhancements, a sentencing enhancement means, how do we explain this as clearly as possible? In New York City, there are sentencing enhancements, pardon me, for gang involvement. So if a person were to be arrested for whatever charge and go to court, and within the investigatory process and the discovery process, we find out that this person has a gang affiliation one way or another, that latches on an extra X amount of years to their sentence. So that's a sentencing enhancement. And we find that it disproportionately impacts people of color and those with mental health issues. Further contextualizing this conversation and stepping back into like a historical context, which we did last week, right? We have to talk about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the initial protection there was limited to white property owning men. So at the time of its creation, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, they primarily protected, again, the rights of white men who owned property. And this was an exclusionary framework that the repercussions of it, we see it today, right? This laid the framework for systemic inequalities for many groups, including women, Black people, and Brown people who were denied basic rights and protections. So women were largely excluded, pardon me, from the rights and privileges outlined in these founding documents. The vast majority of Black people in the Americas were enslaved and had no legal right or protection under the Constitution. We, when we want to think about law enforcement, right, we also have to think about the origins of formalized police forces, right? So it's rooted in slave patrols. The origins of formalized police forces in the United States, they can be directly traced back to slave patrols in southern states. And these patrols were established to enforce laws related to slavery, to capture and punish enslaved people who attempted to escape. So the primary purpose in this instance was to monitor and control the movements of enslaved people in order to ensure that they could not gather, revolt, or escape. And this foundation of policing based on racial control has had, unfortunately, long lasting effects on law enforcement practices in the United States. And, we can't have this conversation without even briefly talking about Jim Crow era's impact on modern policing. So during the Jim Crow era, police forces were instrumental in enforcing segregation laws that mandated the separation of Black and white Americans in public spaces, in educational spaces, in housing. And these laws, they reinforced racial hierarchies and further entrenched systemic racism in American society. So we see this manifest today, right? Like what is happening today, the issues we're grappling with today didn't just happen in a vacuum, right? We have a long contextual history that we need to understand in order to begin even uh, even begin unraveling the modern practices that we see today. So the practices and attitudes that were developed during the Jim Crow era have continued to influence modern policing, contribute to racial profiling, and the disproportionate targeting of Black and Brown people. As I said, understanding this history is crucial for recognizing the roots of the current disparities in our criminal legal system and to begin towards any sort of meaningful reform. So laying that foundation, right, this overrepresentation is rooted in historical practices, including, the exclusionary initial protections of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and the legacy of slave patrols and Jim Crow laws that have contributed to this ongoing systematic bias, right? We see heavier policing in communities of color. So policing practices that have historically been used to control and monitor Black populations, starting with slave patrols, starting with enforcing segregation in the Jim Crow era. This translates to heavier policing in communities of color, perpetuating this cycle of over incarceration or disproportionate incarceration, right? There's a presumption of guilt based on race here. There's a direct, it's this idea that race is a direct descendant of the historical views that considered Black people as inherently criminal. Then this bias was reinforced during the Jim Crow era. There's also like inequities to access to justice that we have to consider. So, historical exclusion from legal protections, so the historical exclusion from the Bill of Rights, from the Constitution, has evolved its way into systemic inequalities in access to justice, with people of color often receiving inadequate representation. And when we're talking about exoneration rates, right, and we're pulling straight from the article that I provided y'all to read from the Innocence Project, now nearly 50% of all exonerees are Black, right? So this statistic reflects the deep-seated racial bias that originates from historical Black practices like biased racial policing, discriminatory legal practices. So from the Innocence Project, they say that 58% of their exonerees are Black. This, again, is traced back to historical exclusion from fair legal processes and protections. And two-thirds are people of color that are not Black or Black in other races or Latino or Brown, etc. Um, and talking a bit about the Innocence Project, right? The Innocence Project works to rectify wrongful convictions and address like the historical injustices that can contribute to racial disparities in the criminal legal system. And they work by addressing and advocating for systemic changes. Eh, mm, and efforts to reform modern policing practices. So they've been crucial, or not necessarily crucial, but they've been an important factor in working to reform policing practices and addressing the historical roots of racial disparities in law enforcement. So their initiatives include advocating for better training on implicit bias, greater accountability. They aim at transforming this historically exclusionary system that was initially created to control Black and brown bodies. Now, moving us away a bit from history and looking at the modern face of policing and policing practices, as well as the practices of the criminal legal system, right? We can look at algorithmic policing, right? Predictive policing. So the purpose of this is to predict the likelihood of crime. So these are some of the ways that miscarriages of justice may happen, right? So predictive policing algorithms, they're designed to forecast when and where crimes are likely to occur based on data analyses. So if we look at recent information about where and when crime happens, we know that crime happens in small blocks of certain neighborhoods, certain places. We know that geography is really important to understand how crime occurs. So these tools are used to allocate police resources more efficiently by attempting to anticipate law-breaking activity. But the data sources of these predictive algorithms are historical crime data. So these algorithms primarily rely on, as I said, historical crime data, and that includes records of past crimes, arrests, and past police activities, which again puts us back into this like cyclical kind of, we're relying on data that may be racist, data that has disparities in it for one reason or another in order to inform us on how we should police and how we should arrest, right? So there are inherent biases in historical crime data. And that brings us to the issue of police activity, right? So police activity and arrests reflect police activity and arrests, not actual crime rates. So historical crime rates, they reflect areas where police have been most active rather than an accurate representation of where crimes are actually occurring, right? So this skewed data is rooted in the historical context of disproportionate policing in communities of color. So it's traced back directly to practices like slave patrol and Jim Crow era enforcement. And it ends up amplifying existing biases. So, since predictive policing algorithms rely on biased historical data, they often perpetuate and amplify these biases. So, the result is this feedback loop where communities of color, which are already heavily policed due to historical biases, they continue to be targeted, right? So, example, the 2016 ProPublica investigation in Broward County, California. So, Black defendants were incorrectly flagged at twice the rate of white defendants. So, flagged as high risk, nearly twice as white defendants. And this was reflecting an underlying racial bias in the data. Conversely, this algorithm that they used underestimated the risk posed by white defendants. And this demonstrated this racial bias in predictive policing tools. And again, these disparities aren't new. They're stemming from our history, and they are stemming from the practices that law enforcement and the criminal legal system utilized, right? And in order for us to understand what's happening today, we have to understand that history. And then we have facial recognition technology, right? So facial recognition technology is used by law enforcement to identify individuals by attempting to compare live images or video footage to a database of stored images. So the aim of this technology is to enhance the efficiency of identifying suspects and solving crimes. But the use of this technology historically was to control and monitor communities of color. So again, we see it manifest in slave patrols and Jim Crow laws. There are some concerns, obviously, about modern day surveillance, privacy violations, especially in communities that are already subjected to heavy policing. And there are issues in accuracy rates across racial groups. So we have Studies have shown that facial recognition technology has a 10 to 100 times higher false identification rate for Black and Asian faces compared to white faces. So this disparity can be traced back again to historical biases, where the needs and the characteristics of people of color were inadequately documented, if you will. And we saw the poorest accuracy for young Black women. So it was particularly inaccurate for young Black women. And this reflected a compounded bias, so a double bias due to both race and gender. These inaccuracies, again, are not new. So there are multiple cases where this technology has been used and it's led to wrongful arrest. So there have been high profile cases where Black men were wrongly arrested because of facial recognition technology and misidentification. So these wrongful arrests highlight the ongoing impact of systemic racial biases in law enforcement tech. And the use of this flawed recognition technology, it can lead to significant harms, right? So including wrongful arrests, exorbitant legal costs, emotional trauma, and damage to reputations, right? So the consequences disproportionately impact people of color, right? And wrongful arrests have the potential to erode trust between communities and law enforcement, which make it harder to achieve justice, to achieve cooperation. And the perpetuation of these biases through technology can reinforce existing inequalities as we know them. So there's a push and pull here, right? There are some potential benefits of these technologies, obviously. So technologies like predictive policing, algorithms like facial recognition, they have the potential to improve the efficiency of law enforcement by allowing them to quickly identify individuals and to quickly allocate resources. So these tools have the potential to enhance public safety and solve crimes more rapidly. And this promise of increased efficiency in law enforcement, it's always been a driving factor, right? However, these benefits have to be weighed against the reality, right? So there are risks and ethical concerns for that we need to navigate, right? So there are privacy issues to consider. The use of these technology, that it raises this significant privacy concern because they involve extensive surveillance and data collection on individuals, right? And this takes us back to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and when does that kick in, right? So historical practices, again, I keep repeating it, but if we root our analyses in history, we're raising some of the same similar privacy concerns and civil liberty concerns here. And another issue is this perpetuates a form of systemic racism. So these technologies can perpetuate existing biases, right? Because they're still relying on this flawed historical data, right? And if it doesn't attempt to consider race, if it doesn't attempt to consider gender, that's just going to keep perpetuating itself, right? Law enforcement practices have been used to marginalize these communities. And if we don't kind of navigate this correctly, these technologies risk continuing that legacy. So the inaccurate targeting of Black and Asian individuals by racial recognition technologies, it echoes these racial biases that we see in historical policing practices. Now, there have obviously been some regulatory efforts, right? So there's the New York Senate bill, S79, and this bill aims to regulate the use of facial recognition technology in order to address privacy and bias concerns. So this bill reflects an understanding that without proper regulation, these technologies are going to exacerbate existing inequities and infringe on individual civil liberties. And there have also been bans, right, or calls for strict regulation on facial recognition software. So there is a growing movement to ban or strictly regulate the use of this software due to its potential for misuse and its history of biases, right? So these calls for regulation are rooted in recognition of past abuse of power and the need to protect vulnerable communities from modern day surveillance and discrimination. Now, some other technologies that are used are gang databases, pardon me. So going back to this concept of sentencing enhancements, one of the ways that it manifests in places like New York City is through the use of gang databases. So inclusion in these gang databases, it often relies on visible indicators, right? So things like tattoos, things like past arrest records. So unfortunately, these criteria can be influenced by biases where certain like cultural expressions and behaviors of marginalized communities are criminalized, right? So it also relies on subjective factors, clothing color, neighborhood, associations with individuals. So uh, the color of your clothes, the neighborhood you reside in, or the neighborhood that your family members reside in, or your associations reside in, your acquaintances reside in. These can be used to label an individual as a gang member. And this subjectivity in gang database inclusion is reflecting kind of the same things that we're talking about over and over again. And we've seen the racial disparities in database composition. So in Portland, we saw that 64% of individuals in gang databases are Black, despite Black people making up only 6% of the city's population. Right. So we're looking at over policing and racial profiling here. In Chicago, 95% of those identified as gang members are people of color, highlighting significant racial biases in law enforcement practices, 95%. So in New York City, 99% of 17,000, over 17,000 people that are included are people of color. And there's no requirements for transparency and notification, right? So this is another reason that people are pushing back so strongly against these technologies. So there is no legal requirement for individuals to be informed when they're added to this gang database, right? This lack of transparency is due to surveillance and over policing. So there's also limited oversight on database management. So these databases, there's, as I said, limited oversight, and there's limited factors as to understanding who's included and who's not included. And then we have DNA databases, right? So DNA databases are used by law enforcement to store genetic profiles obtained from crime scenes, from suspects, and sometimes individuals who have not even been charged with a crime. So these databases, the intention of these databases are to aid in solving crimes by matching DNA found at crime scenes with profiles in databases. But again, there are issues here, including privacy issues and civil liberties issues. So the collection and storage of DNA, it raises significant privacy concerns. And that's due to the fact that genetic information is highly personal and sensitive. So there is this high risk that DNA data could be misused for purposes beyond solving crimes, such as surveillance, such as discrimination. And we see this in New York City, right? So inclusion of profiles from children that are as young as 12 years old. And this raises issues. So the New York City's illegal DNA index, it included profiles from children as young as 12, and that raised serious ethical and legal concerns. And they also included profiles of people who've never been charged with a crime, which violates their civil liberties and presumes guilt without due process, right? So we have an error of due process here. And we also have the potential inclusion of undocumented individuals. So there are concerns that these databases may include profiles of undocumented individuals, which is further marginalizing a very vulnerable population. Now, there's this balance between public safety and civil liberties that we're trying to ride here, right? So while these DNA databases have the potential to enhance public safety by solving crime, they must be balanced against the need to protect individual privacy and civil liberties. There are some potential reforms that are happening. So again, in New York City, the New York Senate bill of 1347, so ending genetic stop and frisk practices. Um, Individuals in this instance are compelled to provide DNA samples without proper justification. And historical parallels here can be drawn to stop and frisk policies that disproportionately targeted Black and Brown people, which led to widespread civil rights violations. And we also have the concern of the purging profiles that were illegally obtained in order to attempt to ensure that databases are used ethically and legally, right? There are tons of concerns that we need to mitigate. But shifting the conversation away from law enforcement practices and the use of these technologies, we also have to understand racial bias in prosecutorial and judicial decisions, right? So we have to understand charging decisions and plea bargains, right? So Black people are 7 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of murder. So Black individuals are disproportionately charged, are disproportionately convicted of serious crimes like murder. And as we stated earlier, they represent some of the highest rates of exonerees. So 12% of exonerees are falsely confessing to crimes. So the pressure to accept plea deals is particularly high among people of color who may lack access to adequate legal representation and face harsher penalties if they go to trial. So the Manhattan study on plea deals, it showed us this information very clearly, right? So a study in Manhattan found that Black defendants were 19 times more likely to be offered jail time in plea deals compared to their white counterparts. And we see this disparity manifest in sentencing as well. So research consistently shows that people of color are receiving harsher sentences compared to white individuals for similar offenses. And this is leading to harsher sentences in general. So there's implicit biases. Judges, like all individuals, right, can harbor implicit biases that influence their sentencing decisions. This is often to the detriment of defendants of color. And socioeconomic factors are also affecting legal representation. So people of color are more likely to be economically disadvantaged. And this affects their ability to secure quality legal representation. And this manifests most dramatically and most harshly and cruelly in capital punishment, right? So, making the connection to lynching here, there's an overlap between states with most lynchings and current death sentences, right? This connection underscores the historical continuity of racial violence and the use of capital punishment as a tool of racial concern. So, our current statistics say that 40% of death row inmates are Black, right? Despite Black people making up only 13% of the US population. And this impact of the victim's race, it impacts death penalty decisions. So 17 times, how am I going to word this? Pardon me. So the race of the victim significantly influences the death penalty decision with much higher execution rates for cases involving white victims. So historically, crimes against white individuals were punished more severely. And this is a trend that unfortunately has continued in modern day capital punishment cases. So a good case to consider, or a relevant case to consider, if you will, is the Rodney Reed and Purvis Payne case. So the case of Rodney Reed and Purvis Payne, it illustrates the racial biases in the death penalty system, where Black men accused of killing white women, they face significant hurdles in proving their innocence. And these cases reflect historical patterns, unfortunately, where Black men were falsely accused and punished for crimes involving white victims, reinforcing unfortunate racial hierarchy. I did not realize how long I've been talking. Let's wrap this up as well as we can. So, again, historical roots. The criminal legal system, the biases that we discussed are deeply rooted in historical practices like slavery, slave patrols, and Jim Crow laws. These practices have long been established, right? And they have manifested in long-lasting patterns of discrimination and control over marginalized communities. So modern statistical evidence, it shows us that significant racial disparities in incarceration, exoneration, and the application of the death penalty. Again, these disparities are a direct continuation, pardon me, of historical inequities and biases. Technologies such as predictive policing algorithms and facial recognition software, they often perpetuate existing racial biases because of this reliance on flawed historical data. So these tools can reinforce systemic racism if not properly regulated and corrected. Right? Racial biases, they affect every stage of the criminal legal process, from charging decisions and plea bargains to sentencing and capital punishments. Right? The disparities, they manifest in modern practices, right? Implementing robust oversight mechanisms and ensuring transparency and the use of policing tools and databases, it can help mitigate some of these biases. And reforming or eliminating algorithms and facial recognition software that demonstrate racial biases is incredibly important for creating a fair justice system. And training and implementing policies to attempt to address implicit biases among prosecutors and judges, it can begin to help us reduce disparities in charging, plea bargaining, and sentencing, right? We're reassessing the application of capital punishment, especially in states with a history of racial violence, and that can help us kind of address the disproportionate impact on people of color, right? So we're going to be pulling from organizations like the Innocence Project, like the Equal Justice Initiative, like the Sentencing Project, in order to learn more about these issues, because these orgs, they provide valuable insight and data on ongoing reform efforts and like the historical context that we need to consider when we're having these discussions, right? Um, and yeah, I think I talked long enough for today. Again, choose your own adventure. One, you don't have to do both. You do not need to do both. Please do not do both. I will see you guys next week. Please reach out for any questions. Again, office hours are on Tuesdays. You can reserve your slot through the Canvas calendar portal. I'm happy to meet with you guys. I'm actually super excited to meet with you guys because we don't really have the opportunity to meet in any other capacity. But that's it from me. I hope this was as understandable as possible.